Back in episode 1, I made you a promise. I told you I would talk about Bride of Frankenstein, a genuine masterpiece, a film so good that it changed what horror was allowed to mean. And then in the very same breath, I would talk about a film with a rubber-suited fish monster getting killed with a kitchen ingredient. And I told you I would mean both of those conversations with exactly the same amount of sincerity. Well, today is the day I make good on the second half of that promise. So picture it, a public beach in Stamford, Connecticut, a bonfire, a local band playing a song they wrote themselves, teenagers doing the twist in grainy black and white, and somewhere just offshore, something that used to be a person is dragging itself out of the water with a face like it lost a fight with a barbecue. That's the movie. That's the entire pitch. So let's talk about the horror of Party Beach. Now, before anybody reaches for their phone to look up the Rotten Tomatoes score, let me just stop you. I know what this film is. It is on the Medved Brothers list of the 50 worst films ever made. Quite an accomplishment. It has been mocked by robots on cable TV, and Roger Corman would have looked at this budget and called it slumming. And I love it anyway. Genuinely, sincerely. Camp, irony, and all. The whole 90 minutes. Well, 78 minutes. They didn't even give themselves 90. Anyway, here's the thing I want to argue today. And I promise it's an actual argument and not just me making excuses for a movie about mutant seaweed. It's no secret that I love bad movies, and I love them for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes it's camp. The color, the swagger, the sheer nerve of a thing that has no business being that extra. Sometimes it's irony. Watching something try that hard and miss that badly is genuinely one of life's greatest pleasures. I'm not embarrassed by either of those. Half of what this show runs on is exactly that kind of love. But there's a third reason I love bad movies, and it's the one I want to make the case for today, because I think it's the one that gets talked about the least. Somewhere out there is a version of this exact story. Mutant fish monsters menace a beach town. Made by people who were embarrassed to be making it. Cutting corners because they didn't care. Phoning it in because it was beneath them. Well, that is not what happened here. Everyone involved in the horror of Party Beach, the director, the sculptor studio building the suits, the real rock band playing their real songs, the 16-year-old kid who got shoved into a monster costume because it happened to fit him. Every single one of them was trying, sincerely, with everything they had, which in most cases was almost nothing. That's the argument for today. Sincerity, sitting right alongside camp and irony rather than replacing them, is one of the things that can make trash cinema worth loving. And this film might be the purest distillation of that particular idea I have ever seen on a screen. Hang on to that thought, because later on I'm going to introduce you to a girl named Tina, and she's going to prove this argument better than I ever could with just words. So let's start at the very beginning, with the deal that made this movie exist in the first place. This film was not somebody's passion project. I need you to understand that going in, because it makes everything else about it more impressive, not less. A producer named Alan Island, whose family owned drive-in theaters up around Albany, New York, went looking for someone to make him a double feature. Not a film, a double feature. 2 movies, cheap, fast, to fill a slot at his family's drive-ins. Luckily, he found Del Tenney. Del was a working actor turned assistant director who, by his own later admission, had been cutting his teeth on films he described, in his own words, as softcore exploitation pictures. This was a man who had absolutely no illusions about making art. And Del Tenney said yes, and made not one but 2 films off that commission. This one and its original double bill partner, The Curse of the Living Corpse, which incidentally was the very first film credit of a young actor named Roy Scheider. A full 10 years before he was standing on a boat telling somebody they were going to need a bigger one. So that's the origin, not inspiration, a distribution gap that needed filling on a budget that Wikipedia lists as $50,000. Though even that number is disputed downward and upward depending on which fan site you ask, which tells you something about how little anyone was keeping careful books. By his own account, Del Tenney himself wasn't even sure it would work. He was nervous about jamming a monster movie into the beach party genre. He didn't know how audiences would take it. He was, by all accounts, genuinely surprised when it became the most successful thing he ever made. A man who didn't think it would work, made purely to fill a hole in a drive-in schedule, using a cast that would almost entirely never act again. That's the sincere part. Not one person on this production had the luxury of cynicism. When you got $50,000 and 3 weeks, you don't have room to phone it in. You only have room to try. Here's my single favorite fact in the entire history of this podcast, and I've done an episode about a haunted embroiderer. The monster costumes for this film were built at the Stamford, Connecticut sculpting studio that once belonged to Gutzen Borglum. You may not know that name, but you absolutely know his work. Gutzen Borglum carved Mount Rushmore. The same tradition of American monumental sculpture that gave us 4 presidents' faces staring out of a South Dakota mountain, also decades later, and under entirely different management, gave us a rubber fishman suit for a movie that would play second billing at a Connecticut drive-in. A theater set designer named Robert Verberkmos actually built the suits. There were only 2 of them made, and when they dried up, one of them turned out to be way too small for the stuntman who was supposed to wear it. So, a production assistant's 16-year-old son, a kid named Charles Friedman, tried it on. It fit. And that's how a teenager ended up playing one of the title monsters in a nationally distributed motion picture. Not because he auditioned, not because he had any training, but because he happened to be the right size when they needed a body in a rubber suit that afternoon. That's the whole production philosophy of this film in one story. Something breaks, somebody improvises, and the show goes on. They shot the monster's underwater transformation by superimposing footage of an actual aquarium full of fish over dissolving stage shots. They used chocolate syrup for blood, same trick Hitchcock used in Psycho that same era, except Hitchcock had a proper effects budget and Del Tenney had a grocery run. And when it came time to actually kill these monsters at the climax, the solution the script lands on is elemental sodium. Someone in the story discovers by accident that pure sodium kills the monsters on contact, and the entire third act becomes a race against time to find enough of it. The fate of humanity in this movie comes down more or less to a giant salt shaker. And can we sit with the actual logic of that one for a second? I mean, these are sea creatures. They live in salt water. The ocean is definitionally an enormous saline solution. And the one thing the script lands on to kill them is more salt. That's not a plot hole so much as the entire foundation of the plot standing on a hole. It would be like discovering a vampire that is fatally allergic to blood. And can we just take a second to actually talk about how these monsters looked? Because I've kind of been dancing around it, and it really deserves a direct hit. Picture, if you will, a hefty bag. A large one. Now stuff about a dozen hot dogs in the mouth area. Add 2 enormous, unblinking bug eyes, a couple of rubber floppy fins that look like pool party leftovers, and you have, ladies and gentlemen, the titular horror of Party Beach. Bug-eyed, fish-finned, and about as seaworthy as a wet paper bag. This is the creature America was supposed to find genuinely terrifying in the summer of 1964. And look, I really feel for whoever was sweating inside that costume because I've been there. I've stood inside a padded, ill-fitting costume, in character, delivering dialogue that no sane person would defend, and I genuinely have no business laughing too hard at a 16-year-old kid who got handed a fish suit because it happened to fit. People who live in glass trailers should not throw stones. Or sodium. Now, I've told you this one before. If you were here for episode 1, you already know it, but for anyone just joining us, I once played a character named Samuel in a micro-budget horror film called Zombique. It was later to be released here in the UK for reasons that would become apparent as The Devil's Cock. The character I played, Samuel, was written as a mentally challenged serial killer, and this isn't a twist, this is just the plot. Samuel gets killed by a satanically possessed chicken and rises from the grave to be killed again. So, when I look at this hot dog-faced, hefty bag, fish-shaped thing lumbering across a Connecticut beach, I don't see a badly designed movie monster. I see a colleague. A fellow traveler in the fine, dignified tradition of being killed on camera by something absurd in a costume somebody clearly built with love and absolutely no budget. That kid in the fish suit and I are, in the most important sense, the same person. We just have different feathered or finned nemeses. Before we move off the production and onto the music, I need to tell you about the marketing because Del Tenney didn't just make this film cheap, he sold it cheap and brilliant. When Horror Party Beach hit theaters, audiences weren't just handed a ticket. They were handed a waiver. An honest-to-God document printed up and posted in the lobby that told you, in so many words, the theater would not be held responsible if you died of fright watching a man in a hefty bag costume menace some teenagers on a beach. You had to sign it before you got in. This is straight out of the William Castle playbook, the same Carnival Barker showmanship that gave the world buzzing theater seats and skeletons on wires. Except Del Tenney didn't have a Castle's budget, so instead of a rigged theater, he built the Gimmick out of a single sheet of paper and pure nerve. It is genuinely one of my favorite pieces of horror marketing ever devised, because it understood something a lot of bigger, glossier productions never quite figure out. The promise of an experience can do as much work as the experience itself. Now here's a piece of this film that people underestimate because it's easy to hear a jangly rock number in a monster movie and assume it's filler. It is not filler. It might be the most sincere thing in the entire picture. The band in this film, playing themselves at the beach party, are called the Del Airs, and they were a real working band, not actors, not a novelty act assembled for the shoot. These were guys from Paterson, New Jersey, who played the Peppermint Lounge in New York, who had been the house band at a club in Coney Island, working musicians one and all. They performed 6 songs across the film. 3 of them were written by the film's actual composers, but 3 of them, including one literally entitled Elaine, named after the female's lead, were written by the band members themselves. Their guitarist wrote a love song for a character in someone else's monster movie, and it made the final cut. And here's the detail that gets me. By most accounts, the Del Airs broke up not long after the film was shot, which means this movie, a movie almost nobody was supposed to remember, accidentally preserved one of the last times this particular band ever played together. Nobody set out to make a document of a band's final summer together. Nobody was being that sentimental about it. They were just a working band who took a paying gig, playing music they'd written themselves, sincerely, one more time, in a film that happened to survive long after they didn't. And here's a personal one for you. The song The Zombie Stomp, technically written for the film by the composers Edward Earl Marsh and Wilfred Holcomb, not by the band themselves, but the Del Airs absolutely make it their own, is still, 60 years later, a fixture on my own Halloween playlists. It's a proper dancecraft song, one of those call and response beach numbers built entirely around getting a room full of teenagers to do a specific move on command, with a hook that tells you exactly what to do and precisely how good you're going to feel doing it. And it works. Every single October, without fail, it earns its spot in the rotation on its merits. Not as a novelty, not ironically, just because it is a genuinely catchy piece of 1964 rock and roll that happens to be about zombies. And if you want to go down a real rabbit hole with this band, years later one of their songs got covered by a punk outfit called Sloppy Seconds. And there's a genuine, if slightly tenuous, connective thread running from this drive-in monster movie all the way to jazz producer Teo Macero's orbit, by way of a band called Gas Mask. I'm not going to pretend I fully understand how that thread holds together, but it exists, and it delights me that it exists, and that's enough for today. Now let's talk about what genre this film actually thought it was crashing into, because Del Tenney told us himself. He described his own movie as a, quote, a takeoff on beach parties and musicals. In 1963, AIP released Beach Party, starring Frankie Avalon and Annette Funicello, who was on loan from Walt Disney himself. Now, Frankie and Annette were professional Hollywood teen idols, and their wholesome image was carefully protected. So much so that Annette Funicello, despite starring in a series with the word bikini in half the titles, never once wore an actual bikini on screen. Walt Disney would not allow it. That's the genre. It's all good, clean fun, the director of one of those films said. No hearts are broken and virginity prevails. Now, if you want the clearest possible illustration of what happens when you take that genre and refuse to sand off the edges, I want you to meet Tina. Tina is technically a secondary character in Horror of Party Beach. She is also, unofficially, my favorite person in this entire film, and she's dead within the first 15 minutes. Tina is what happens when you take the Annette Funicello role, the pretty girl at the beach party, and forget to put the good girl chaperone rules back on her. She swills booze straight out of a paper bag in front of God and everybody at the beach. She flirts, loudly, in front of her own boyfriend, because apparently that's just a Tuesday for Tina. She does an honest-to-God impromptu striptease in front of the entire beach crowd, kids and all, and this is my favorite part. She single-handedly starts a rumble between the local biker gang and the clean-cut beach kids, purely because she's having a better time than anyone thinks she's allowed to. Annette Funicello was contractually forbidden from wearing an actual bikini. Tina, several states and one budget bracket away, is out here starting fights and shedding her clothes on command. That is the entire difference between these two genres, standing right there in one character. And then, because this is still, underneath everything, a monster movie, Tina does what horror movies have been doing to women like her since the genre existed. She sheds the last of her inhibitions, runs into the surf, and swims out to a nearby jetty for what I can only describe as some private Tina time. And that, of course, is exactly when the titular Horror of Party Beach decides to introduce itself. I won't pretend there isn't a very old, very tired horror movie logic at work here. The wild girl doesn't survive the second act. She never does. But I will say this, for about 10 glorious minutes of screen time, Tina is having a far better time at this beach party than Annette Funicello was ever contractually allowed to have at hers. She is, and I say this with total sincerity, something of a spirit animal to me. I'll also say, and this isn't a criticism so much as an observation, that several of these teenagers at this beach party look like they have not seen the inside of a high school in a decade. This was, and remains, an extremely common feature of the genre. Nobody involved seemed to bother by it. Neither am I. Now take that exact template, teenagers, beach music, romance, and shoot it in black and white on a public beach in Stamford, Connecticut, with a real local motorcycle gang instead of stunt performers, a real bar band instead of a manufactured pop duo, and $50,000 budget instead of Disney money. That's not an accident of poverty. Del Tenney said it himself. It was a deliberate takeoff. He looked at the biggest teen genre in the country, the one selling out drive-ins from coast to coast that very same year, and said, I can make that my way with what I've got. And then, having made his beach party movie, he threw a rubber-suited fish monster into the middle of it, because why the hell not? Now, I promised you this was going to be a fun episode, and it mostly is. But I'm not the kind of host who gets to enjoy the parts of a film I like and skip past the parts that aren't fun. I've never done that on this show, and I'm not starting today. There's a character in this film named Eulabelle. She's the family maid, played by an actress named Eulabelle Moore. And for the entire runtime, Eulabelle is written as the superstitious comic relief. She's the one who keeps insisting over and over that the monster attacks are voodoo. It is, by any honest measure, a dated, stereotyped role. Critics who study black representation in horror have called it exactly that. Barely evolved from the maid roles Hollywood had already been leaning on for 30 years by that point. Here's the part that complicates it, though, and I think it's the part that actually matters. It's Eulabelle who figures out the solution. She's the one who spills sodium on a severed monster arm in the lab and discovers, quite by accident, the one thing that can stop these creatures. She's the one who keeps pushing the male lead to keep calling around town until he finds enough of it. In a film full of men standing around discussing the problem, the maid, written in as a punchline, is functionally the reason everybody survives. And the film never once acknowledged that. She gets no credit, no narrative reward, not even a decent final scene. And here's the fact that turned this, for me, from an uncomfortable footnote into something that actually sat with me all week. Eulabelle Moore was not some novice they pulled off the street. She had a real career. 15 Broadway productions, including a run in A Streetcar Named Desire. Reviewers of her stage work called her an accomplished comedic actress. This woman had range and craft and a body of real work behind her. This film, this rubber-suited chocolate syrup $50,000 drive-in picture, was her last screen credit. She died in 1964, the same year the film was released. A serious stage actress with a real career behind her, closed out her time on film playing a stereotype for a joke, in a movie that then quietly let her character be the one who actually saves everyone, without ever noticing it had done that. I think about this because it isn't only a movie thing for me. Growing up in rural South Carolina, we had someone who filled a similar role in our house. Her name was Annie Lou. She helped my mother around the house, and she looked after me when I was really small. She was a big, warm woman with a gold front tooth that flashed when she smiled, and who let me stay up a little past my bedtime more times than my mother probably ever found out about. I loved her, in the completely uncomplicated way a small child loves an adult who is kind to him. But I'm old enough now to know the uncomplicated part was mine, not hers. A black woman working in a white household in rural South Carolina in the 60s was carrying a whole history I wasn't equipped to see at that time. Doing work that was rarely paid what it was worth, and even more rarely credited for what it had actually held together. I don't know her full story. I wish I did. I never thought to ask because I was a child, and children don't tend to ask the people who love them what it costs to be there. I'm not telling you that story to say we had our own Eulabelle too. That would just be doing to Annie Lou exactly what this film did to Eulabelle Moore, making her a supporting detail in someone else's story. I'm telling you because Eulabelle Moore's role in this film isn't a distant historical curiosity to me. It's a pattern I recognize from my own house, not just from a movie screen. I don't have a tidy way to resolve that, and I'm not going to pretend I do. I'm not going to tell you it ruins the film, and I'm not going to tell you it doesn't matter. Both of those are true at once, and I think the honest thing, the sincere thing, is to just say it plainly and let it sit there, the way it sat with me. That's the cost of insisting on sincerity as the standard instead of irony. You don't get to only be sincere about the parts that are easy to love. In 1997, the much-loved Mystery Science Theater 3000 gave this film the full treatment, bots and all. And if you've never watched that episode, drop what you're doing right now and go find it. It is absolutely one of my favorite Mystery Science episodes, and my favorite riff from the whole hour is delivered completely deadpan by Mike Nelson when he says, the director bravely mixes tedium with unscariness. There's also a bit about the monster's face being roughly 80% eye bag and a genuinely inspired riff about radiation apparently having a sense of humor. Whoever was in that writer's room that week understood this film completely. Speaking of writers, let's talk about Stephen King, because I know some of you have heard the rumor floating around that this is a King favorite, and I need to correct that right now on the record because I got it wrong myself the first time I went digging into this. Stephen King does not love this movie. In his 1981 nonfiction book, Danse Macabre, King described the horror of Party Beach, and this is about as close as a direct quote as I'm going to give you, as an abysmal little wet fart of a film. That is not affection. That is a horror legend telling you, in no uncertain terms, that this movie is bad. But here's the nuance, because King is smarter than a one-line takedown. Even while he's dragging the filmmaking, he credits it with accidentally predicting real anxieties about nuclear waste and environmental dumping years before anyone was having that conversation seriously. He hated it as art. He found it genuinely fascinating as a cultural artifact. That's what he calls the negative charm of bad horror. You can think something is garbage and still find it worth talking about. Which, incidentally, is basically the entire mission statement of this show. And look, that's fairly faint praise coming from the same man who gave the world Maximum Overdrive. Now, I love me some Stephen King. I will defend most of his catalog to the death, but he does not get to throw stones from that particular glass house. If Stephen King is the sharp end of this film's reappraisal, Del Tenney himself is the soft end. People have called him, not unkindly, Connecticut's own Ed Wood, a guy operating with no money, no illusions, and just enough sincerity to make something that outlived every single person who mocked it. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a film made by people filling a contractual hole in a drive-in schedule, using monster suits built in a dead sculptor's studio, starring a band playing the last songs they'd ever play together, and containing, buried inside all that cheerful nonsense, one real person's story that the film itself never had the decency to notice. And somehow, out of all that, it has endured. It became exactly the kind of film that gets mocked by robots on national TV and takes both hits without ever stopping being loved. And in 2018, a company called Severin Films sat down and gave this 78-minute drive-in picture a proper high-definition restoration on Blu-ray. Special features and all. Nobody was forced to do that. Somebody, decades later, cared enough to make it look good. That's sincerity winning, all the way down. Nobody involved in this film at any stage, not Del Tenney, not the Del Ayers, not a 16-year-old kid squeezed into a monster suit, not even in her own complicated way, Eulabelle Moore herself was being ironic about what they were doing. They were all, every one of them, simply trying. And 60 years later, we're still watching it. That's the whole argument. Bad taste done properly is never the joke. It's the commitment. Next time on Baths to the Bone, we're taking a little trip down to Midian. If you don't know, that's where the monsters dwell, and apparently it looks surprisingly like Canada. We'll be talking about Clive Barker's Nightbreed, his full-throated Tribe of Monsters love letter to every outsider who was ever told the dark was exactly where they belonged. I have some thoughts on that one. I have lots of thoughts on that one, actually. So if you want more of this, more horror, more cult film, more bad taste done properly, you can find the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're on Apple Podcasts, a review takes 30 seconds and genuinely helps more people find the show. If you want to support what we're doing here, Patreon is also available. The link is in the show notes, along with every film and every person mentioned in this episode. With that, I'm Baz, and this has been Baz to the Bone, where we do horror, cult film, and bad taste properly. Now, go put on a rock and roll record and think kindly of someone who never got their due. I'll see you in a fortnight.